structure, like a game, to hold back that complexity. That's why you need routines in your household. That's why you need predictability in terms of your caretakers. That's why you need rules of the game. It's so that things don't get out of hand. Now, let's say that you adopt an extremely liberal parenting orientation and your children start to push the boundaries. Well, you're not going to stop them. And so that means they're going to push the boundaries harder and harder. And that's going to make them more and more anxious because there's not enough structure. And then let's say they hit teenagehood and puberty. And maybe you're unfortunate. You have a girl who hits puberty a little early and she's a little immature and she's a little sensitive to negative emotion and maybe not quite as popular as she might be. And she's quite confused and anxious and she starts pushing the boundaries pretty damn hard on the gender identity front. And then you've got real trouble, especially if she's also being exposed to a passel of idiot teachers who are doing everything they possibly can to capitalize on her confusion. And so it seems to me that what we are seeing on the gender dysphoria front, which is a form of social contagion and a psychogenic epidemic, is an extension of boundary pushing behavior. It's so a girl can come up to her parent when she's 12 and do a bunch of things at the same time. She can say, well, I think maybe I'm a boy. Okay, so what exactly is going on there? Well, certainly a challenge to social authority. It's a challenge to parental authority. It's an expression of a deep discontent and a level of chaotic anxiety and confusion. And then it's also the only way, as far as I can tell, that the child can test the relationship between the teachers and their ideology, say gender-affirming ideology, and the rules at home that the parents are trying to abide by. Because the kids at school are going to be taught, look, everybody's got a subjectively defined identity, and you might not be as masculine or feminine as you've been led to believe. And anyone who tells you different is a detestable bigot to such a degree that you should actually keep all of this secret and never even talk to them. It's like, how the hell is a kid going to sort through all that without going home and saying something like, Mom, sometimes I think maybe I'm a girl? Like, because they're not going to be able to delineate this out in some complex philosophical manner. Adults can't bloody well do that. And so, sorry, that's a bit of a rant, but you can see where I'm going here.
Well, yeah, I mean, how can teenagers rebel against their parents anymore? They can't be goths, they can't be punks, they can't be emos. They can go into, drugs and drink maybe. But it's the adolescent's job is to separate from the parents. And we know that adolescents are far more influenced by their peer group than their parents. And this is the agony for parents because they're at an age where parents should be letting go, should be widening that boundary so that the child can push against the boundary of the outside world more as they take this journey, which is from childhood to adulthood. It's not it's a rocky road for a lot of teenagers, most I would say, and so that pushing against the boundaries. Part of that job is to reject the parents and reject the parents' values. And so parents of adolescents are even more in a position where they're tearing their hair out because they know that if they're giving advice to their children, that's not the advice their kids are listening to. They're listening to what's going on in their peer group. So it's a huge thing for society to have been put on to this generation of children and that parents feel helpless about. And the parents' job in adolescence is really to tread that line, and particularly in this area of speaking the truth, giving their children facts. That is a responsibility of parents. And you may be the only person in that child's life who is doing that. And it's also to allow the child more freedom and more freedom of expression. So it's a real dance between, and it's all about keeping up a good, strong relationship with that child and keeping communication channels open.
Right. Well, in some ways you could think about the model you used, which is, say, integration versus individuation, is that as the child becomes more autonomous, putting more stress on individuation makes more and more sense, right? Because you've already laid down the groundwork for their social acceptance. And then as they move into adolescence, first of all, they can't abide by your household rules entirely because they'd never leave home if that was the case, right? They have to have that drive towards independence. And that's going to mean establishing their own system of values in some sense so that they can move away from you and do that autonomously. And so they are going to be set against you in some real sense. The problem is that, well, I suppose part of the problem that parents run into at the moment is that that's been weaponized. That proclivity has been weaponized in the name of this extremely strange gender ideology that insists that identity, well, we could take that apart a little bit. That might be useful. So one of the things that really strikes me as odd as a psychologist, there's two things, I suppose, when I look at modern claims about identity. The first is that identity is subjectively defined. I think that is so utterly preposterous. I can't believe that we're even entertaining it as a culture. It's so idiotic. Every single time I have a conversation with my wife, or with anyone else for that matter, but let's say with my wife, I'm negotiating my identity, just as she's negotiating hers, because we have our viewpoints and our proclivities for action, and each of us have our tendency to insist that our way is the right way. But if you're going to be around other people, you have to constantly negotiate that so that you can stand each other. And so a real identity is actually the ability to negotiate the transformation of your own identity in a social space. It has nothing to do with you subjectively defining your identity. So that's, now, as far as I can tell, the only people who are unable to negotiate identity and who insist upon having it subjectively defined are literally 2 years old. Because according to Piaget, and there's some good research support for the basic outlines of his theory, two-year-olds are too egocentric to negotiate a shared play space. So their identity is subjectively defined, and they're almost entirely hedonistically oriented, which means they run by whim, which everyone knows if you're around 2-year-olds, and they can't play with other children. Okay, so the idea that identity is subjectively defined is utterly preposterous. And it's actually an anti-truth, because if you try to define your identity subjectively, you are a bloody tyrant, and you're going to be an unpopular one too, and you deserve it. But then, secondarily, we have this other weird insistence, and I don't know why we've become so demented that we also accept this, that your identity is subjectively defined, but nonetheless, the core element of your identity is some immutable group characteristic, and the one we stress most is sexual attraction. And I suppose the secondary one is something like race. It's so peculiar that your identity is subjectively defined, but it's also boxed into this very narrow set of parameters, which is, well, the most important thing about you is who and to what degree, to whom and to what degree are you sexually attracted? It just leaves me speechless. Well, it doesn't, but you get my point.
So I think what we're seeing is this idea of subjective identity taken to its absolute extreme. Because you're right, up to 2 years old, it amazes me how so many parenting books are based on building your child's self-esteem. Well, sorry, your child is born, your child is only self-esteem, nothing else. They, for their survival, they have to be. So it's not the adult's job to build the child's self-esteem as if that's something we can put on them. It's part of your child's interaction with life, with the environment, in relationships that build self-esteem. So it might be achievement. It might be, something that you can do, something that you achieve, and then you feel good about yourself. It's not your parents always telling you you're amazing, you're brilliant, and praising them. And so, and also that idea of identity, it's the idea of the self, this thing that you're supposed to be born with. And I don't know what myself is yet, and I'm 63. I'm going to, I don't know, because it changes. It changes according to circumstances. I don't know if I'd be a great person to be on a lifeboat with, for example, would I be the one that stood up and saved people, helped save others? Would I be so scared? I don't know. I don't know myself, and I don't believe there is a fixed self that we move through life with. We're always changing according to our circumstances and our environment, and perhaps we get to know ourselves a bit better. But we can still fool ourselves. We can still be dishonest about who we are to ourselves. So that idea that the child possesses this innate identity, innate sense of self, it's one of the ways that we now, well, apart from the fact that it's nonsense, the roles have been completely reversed between adult and child. So we are encouraged to see children as wise and as knowing themselves, and that we follow the child. We follow you hear parents say, "Oh, I've learned far more from my child than they've ever learned from me." Well, that's the wrong way round. You are the adult. You are the one that's gathered life experience and hopefully some wisdom. And again, to put that that responsibility onto a child to be the all-knowing fount of wisdom. And we do that to teenagers as well. But when you look at the adolescent years, that identity formation becomes really the adolescent's job. Who am I? So I'm not a child anymore. I'm developing into an adult. Who am I? What teenagers do is they find their tribe, and in a way they integrate before they can individuate, because they find the tribe and they wear the same and they speak the same language and they like the same music, or now YouTube videos and the rules that, we may mock this. I've heard people mock it, but it's absolutely right that, it's a stage of development. And now the only tribe that you might describe as any kind of counterculture is trans, having a gender and sexual identity. And there is no other tribe that children can join to show that they don't conform, or that they're a bit different, or that, it's only gender identity now. So if you want to be seen as boring and conventional and traditional and conservative and everything that a teenager doesn't want to appear to be, then you have to join that tribe and at least say, "Oh, I'm non-binary," or to be able to show that side of yourself, unless you're really comfortable in the idea that you're conventional and you don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, well, that means that they've captured. So I'll go in two directions with regard to what you said. Years ago, I did a study with a colleague of mine at Harvard on when tattooing and piercing first entered the cultural scene. And we were curious about whether that was a marker for psychopathology or what was predicting the adoption of these new fashion trends. And what we found overwhelmingly was that it wasn't associated with an increased prevalence of mental illness. It was associated with high trait openness. And that's the creativity dimension from the big five, trait openness. And when you see people with rainbow-colored hair or multicolored hair and piercings and so forth, you're looking at people who are on the creative end of the distribution. And the point you're making is in part that the collapse of the entire domain of nonconformity into gender identity also entices the creative kids. Creative kids have more mutable identities too. So the claim that well, I'm a different person from day to day is particularly germane to creative kids, because a creative person is quite different from day to day. That's actually the definition of creativity. And if you're creative and high in negative emotion, that's even worse, because not only are you mutable on the identity side, that's actually your identity, that mutability. You're also very, very volatile in terms of your moods. And so the idea that identity is only mutable can be very, very attractive to you. Now, I also wanted to make a comment technically about self-esteem. So I spent a lot of time analyzing self-esteem psychometrically, because as a clinician, I was extremely skeptical of the social psychological research purporting to indicate, for example, that there was even such a thing as self-esteem. Because we bandy about these words, but that doesn't mean they have a corresponding grounding in reality. So I looked at and conducted factor analytic studies, which were designed to assess what exactly self-esteem was. And it's quite straightforward. And people who are listening might find this extremely useful practically. There's no such thing as self-esteem. What there is trait neuroticism, which is proclivity to anxiety and pain, essentially, emotional and physical. So people differ in their thresholds for being anxious and hurt. And if you're more sensitive, well, then you'll see threats before people who are less sensitive, and that can be useful. And if you're less sensitive, well, then you're more robust and maybe more daring, and that can be useful. No, there's no way of saying what's right in that situation. However, if you're high in neuroticism, if you're high in sensitivity to negative emotion, you do experience a lot of anxiety and depression. Okay, so self-esteem is basically neuroticism minus extroversion. And extroversion is the positive emotion dimension. And so highly neurotic people, so people sensitive to negative emotion, are more likely to be self-conscious and to think negative thoughts about themselves. But that doesn't mean that it's a fractured self-concept that's driving the negative emotion. That's simply not true. That negative emotional state is actually baseline temperament. You can measure it in infants. You can measure it in kids that are 6 months old, and you can ameliorate it to some degree. If you have a child who's sensitive to negative emotion and you facilitate their exploration, their autonomous exploration, they can normalize their psychophysiology. Okay, so first of all, there's no such thing as self-esteem. It's basically trait neuroticism. And second, you do not remediate trait neuroticism by getting people to focus on their feelings. In fact, making people self-conscious about their feelings makes trait neuroticism worse, because there's no difference between being self-conscious and being high in trait neuroticism. So, and then the last part of all of that that's preposterous is you certainly don't remediate people's self-esteem. You talk about this in your book with regards to overpraise, by continually telling children how wonderful they are. Because what actually regulates their negative emotion, to say it again, isn't their internal psychological state or their attitude towards themselves. It's whether or not other people like to have them around. So if you have a child who's very popular, surrounded by friends, who's got a couple of best friends, whose teachers respond positively to them, who other parents respond to well, who can regulate their behavior when they're out in public in a grocery store or a restaurant so that adults are kind and smile to them, the probability that they're going to experience excess negative emotion is tremendously ameliorated. And so that's another strike on the conservative side, like a hit on the conservative side of the parenting spectrum. It's like you help make your children socially acceptable and you will increase their self-esteem. You don't do that by giving them participation awards at school and falsely inflating their ego.
You don't ride an elevator for the music, or choose an airline for their movie selection. When it comes to audio entertainment, it makes sense to choose Audible. Audible is the home of storytelling, whether it's an epic adventure, a chilling mystery, or a can't-miss comedy. It houses all your audio entertainment, audiobooks, podcasts, and originals in one single app, so that you can find the best of what you love or discover something new. As an Audible member, you can choose one title per month to keep from their entire catalog, including the latest bestsellers and new releases. Members also get full access to a growing selection of included audiobooks, Audible originals, and podcasts. You can download or stream included titles all you want. You can even listen to Dr. Peterson's Beyond Order on Audible. Let Audible help you discover new ways to laugh, be inspired, or be entertained. New members can try it for free for 30 days. Visit audible.com/Peterson or text Peterson to 500-500. That's audible.com/Peterson or text Peterson to 500-500 to try Audible free for 30 days. audible.com/Peterson.
That's really interesting what you say about self-esteem, yeah, because it's it is bandied around. It's part of parenting advice, so much now. But really, what does it mean? Does it mean a sense of satisfaction with yourself? Does it mean, because there is a healthy, I guess there's like a healthy kind of confidence that you in life. But again, I think that's so much generated by how you react with the world. We're social creatures. And if we cannot have or develop a positive relationship with the world and our environment and the people we meet, yes, and then we're not likely to have a feeling of kind of confidence in ourselves. But I think you're right about that there are innate personality characteristics or temperaments, and they can be tempered and they can be helped so that the child is, you get the positive side of that more than the negative side, because with every temperament there is a positive and a negative, and that what you want is to go with your child's character or personality and encourage the positive side of that more than facilitating the negative. And maybe that's the closest we can get to building your child's self-esteem.
Well, I talked to this psychologist 2 weeks ago, Jean Twenge, and Twenge is a pretty good psychologist. She's a good statistician. She's good at psychological measurement, which is really important when you're dealing with the sorts of things we're talking about. And for a long time on the self-esteem front, there was this idea that positive affirmations for children were the way to self-esteem. But that was dependent on the theory that your level of negative emotion was dependent on your attitude towards yourself, something like that. It was only a psychological variable. But what Twenge found was that all that false praise, that devaluation of the currency of reward, that overgeneralization of insistence upon your child's singular wonderfulness at the expense of other people, it didn't improve self-esteem. What it did was inflate narcissism. So then you got the best of both worlds. You got kids that were just as miserable on the negative emotion front, just as confused and anxious, but they're also narcissistic. And so that actually produced a bit of a spiral, because, it's a little bit more difficult to make friends if you're high in negative emotion, because you're a bit more volatile, you're a bit more sensitive. You're also a little more timid in your social interactions. So you already got a couple of things working against you. Now, if you add a nice healthy dose of narcissism to that, then you're going to produce a child who's unbelievably unpopular and dislikable, because there's almost no one more dislikable than a neurotic narcissist. That's a tough combination too, because you get that hypersensitivity along with grandiosity. You might be able to tolerate one of those, but man, the combination of that's pretty damn unbearable. And so all this idiot insistence on self-esteem through continual affirmation, that would also be part and parcel of the elimination of competition in schools, right? Because you don't want anybody to lose, because God only knows what that might do to their self-concept and their self-esteem. You produce this increase in self-centered narcissism, and you make kids more isolated and miserable and lonely than they would have otherwise had to be. It's a real perfect storm. A lot of that can be laid at the feet of social psychologists, by the way. So doing very, very badly thought through and analyzed research in clinical domains. The whole self-esteem, bloody, monstrous movement, that's one of the catastrophes that's emerged out of the research fields.
I also think parents have been encouraged to be therapists to their children, to be counsellors. And what you mentioned earlier about feelings, when I worked with parents, it was constantly, a child would come home and say, somebody kicked me in the playground. And the first question from the parent was not, so what did you do about it or what happened? But, and how did that make you feel? And right. And how did that make you feel? And how did you feel about that? And what it does is it gives power to feelings above actions. And so you get a child who, then the child stops and thinks, well, how did I feel about it? And it's usually, sad or angry or happy, this sort of very limited range of feeling words. And so then the child's thinking, that's the important thing. And it's always back to the child looking internally rather than looking outside and saying, so this was what the situation was. And then maybe if the child was being bullied, or maybe if the child had a part in it, we listen to that, we can, perhaps help the child manage it better next time. Or maybe the child doesn't have a problem with it at all. It's just sharing some information with us. But if we bring that back every time to the child's feelings, then the child is growing up thinking, my feelings are the most important thing.
Okay, so let's look at that. So first of all, we might ask, what the hell do we mean by feeling? And what we mean is something like immediate emotional response. Okay, and then we say, well, feelings are paramount. We're also simultaneously saying immediate emotional response is paramount. Okay, so let's just think about that for a minute. So let's say my wife says something that makes me angry. All right, so why aren't I just right? It's like, you just said something that made me angry. Now I'm angry. My feelings are paramount. I'm angry. I feel like hurting you, let's say, because I'm so angry. Why am I not right in doing that? And why are we insisting to children that their instantaneous emotional impulse is the appropriate marker for reality? Because the alternatives would be, well, who cares what you felt about it? What did you do about it? Or on the bullying front, let's say, what are you going to do about it? Independent of your feelings, whether you're angry or upset or looking for a fight or challenged, whatever. I want to know how you're going to cope with this situation actively so it doesn't occur again. And then by walking through that, let's say if you're talking to a teenager, you're also privileging thinking over feeling. And so then you might say, well, what is thinking? And the answer is, thinking and acting are what mature people replace feeling with. So the only time we need to feel something, especially on the negative emotion side, is really when things don't go the way we want them to go. So you feel, forget about positive emotion for a minute, you feel in consequence of inadequate adaptation. That's like a rule. And so to privilege feeling means you're privileging inadequate adaptation. And you're also saying, well, your first impulsive whim, which is driven by these basic biological mechanisms that are very id-like in the Freudian sense, they're not sophisticated at all. By making them paramount, you raise them to the point of the highest virtue. The highest virtue is what you feel. And then it's even worse than that, Stephanie, because this is so awful. It really is. If you do careful linguistic analysis of communicative content, one of the things, and emotions, let's say, communicative content and emotion, one of the things you find reliably is all self-conscious thoughts load on neuroticism. So there is literally no difference between thinking about how you feel and being miserable. They are exactly the same thing. So what you're doing with, it's so interesting, it's so sad, right? But you can kind of understand this if you think about self-consciousness. So imagine you're on stage and you're delivering a talk, and all of a sudden you get self-conscious. Well, you think self-consciousness is a good thing. It's like, no, it's not. You sweat, you blush, you stutter, you forget what you're doing, you collapse into yourself, you get self-centered, you don't pay attention to the audience, you're no longer able to communicate, and it can be a real catastrophe. Like, people can get so self-conscious on stage that they develop a phobia of public speaking. And that's all pathology of self-consciousness. And so now what we do with our children at every bloody turn, and they do this in school all the time. Well, how are you feeling? How are you feeling? How are you feeling? How are you feeling? And the other implication there, and you talk a lot about nonverbal behavior in your book and how we communicate with children. We're also telling our children all the time that if you feel bad, anxiety, let's say, or some emotional pain, that's so awful that that's all sensible and caring adults should ever care about. And so what kind of message is that for children? It's like, oh my God, you were upset at school. What a cataclysm that is. We should probably restructure the entire social apparatus so that never even happens once. It's multidimensionally preposterous. And it's really hurting kids to make them self-conscious like that.
So I love what you say about self-consciousness and causing depression. And I mean, you can see it so clearly in this idea that children, well, adolescents in particular now have this new a childhood task of exploring their gender identity. Because what does that mean other than they must look at their every behavior, the way they like to dress, everything that... There was a book I read, which is it's a workbook for teenagers on exploring your gender identity. And basically, you're looking at every aspect of your personality, everything about you and relating it to gender. Does that make me a girl or does that make me a boy? And of course, it's inevitably based on stereotypes. It can't be anything else because boys can't experience female things like menstruation and girls can't experience male things like erections, let's say. It's got to be stereotypes. There's nothing else. And, one of these books that I read, because teenagers now, there's a plethora of books, including workbooks, to help you along your gender journey. It's sometimes called a quest. It's this sort of adventure. And it was talking about bends in a river, that each time you get to a bend in the river, you stop and you think about your gender identity. Well, gender identity is a meaningless concept anyway. It's not, scientifically supported that we have this thing. But it's a way to get teenagers to constantly be looking at themselves, looking at their motivations and analysing their actions, which I think
it's worse. It's worse than that.
It will inevitably create mental health issues. Inevitably.
Depression. Yeah, well, look. Here's what it's analogous to. Okay, so imagine that there are twists and turns in the bends of the river of your marriage. And there are constant micro challenges and disputes that emerge in the course of the marriage. Okay, here's the new rule, okay? Every time you encounter any doubt whatsoever in your life, question the integrity of your marriage. Right, okay, so here's what happens to a depressed person. So let's say you have a little bit of a dispute with your husband. And it produces a little negative emotion. And you think, oh my God, I caused some trouble. That's the first thought. I caused some trouble. Here's the next thought. I've caused a lot of trouble in the past. Next thought. I caused a lot of trouble in the present, and I'm likely to continue to cause a lot of trouble in the future. Okay? A person who causes a lot of trouble in the past, present, and future, they're really not a very good person. They're not really fit for a marriage. They're probably not fit to live. I should commit suicide. Okay, so that's how a depressive person thinks. Now, think about how that works. So you go from a micro challenge, you had a little scrap with your wife, and then you take yourself apart right down to the foundation. And the foundation in that case would be, do you even have the right to exist? And so a depressive person has no defense against that cascade of doubt. Okay, so now imagine this is what we're doing to children. We know that children establish the ability to distinguish between male and female extremely early. They can do that as infants. They can likely do it as newborns. So that ability to distinguish between male and female is fundamental. The reason it's fundamental, obviously, is because if you can't distinguish between male and female, you're not going to reproduce. So Now, we know not only is that true biologically, but also conceptually, it seems the case that the distinction between masculine and feminine symbolically is a distinction that's at the bottom of our ability to perceive as such. We tend to make gendered categories in the world almost automatically. So there might be no more fundamental perceptual category than sexual differentiation. It might be more fundamental than up or down, or dark or light. It's at least in the same domain. So this is now what we're doing to teenagers when they're confused. We're saying every time you manifest even a shred of doubt about anything, the first thing you should do is question the most fundamental element of your being, and you should do that continually. And then it's even worse than that, even though that's really bad, because we're dooming them to something like anxious depression by doing that. It's even worse than that, because, well, let's say I've been reading about this like demi boy identity. It's sort of, well, mostly you're a boy, but sometimes you feel that you're a girl. It's something like that, or maybe I have it backwards. I don't really give a damn, to tell you the truth. But here's the problem with that. It's like, let's say you have a non-standard gender identity. Okay, what the hell are other people supposed to do about that? Like, what are the rules here, right? Because if you're a woman, I kind of know how to treat you. I'm going to do it in a stereotyped way to begin with, because I don't know who the hell you are, so I'm going to use, low-resolution approximations, and those are going to be stereotypes. They're no different than categories. And then when I get to know you, I'll particularize it. But if I don't know whether you're male or female, what the hell should I do with you? You don't know, because you don't know what the rules are. And so the simplest thing for me to do is just not do anything with you. The simplest thing for me to do is go find someone else who's a hell of a lot less trouble and who's willing to abide by the social norms enough so that they don't present a mass of indeterminate confusion on immediate confrontation. And then, the riposte from the transgender side is, well, if you were a little more tolerant, you'd know how to give me what I want. It's like, I don't have a bloody clue how to give you what you want. I have no idea. I don't know how to give me what I want. I can barely manage it with my wife. I certainly have no idea what to give a bald man with a mustache in a red dress. I have no idea what to do with you, and neither do you. No one knows the rules. So we tell kids, question your identity, specify your non-binary orientation, but then what? Like, what's the life path associated with that? How are you going to conduct yourself as an adult, as someone who's non-binary? Are you going to get married? How are people going to treat you at work? What are you going to do with your kids? How are you going to dress? You don't know the answer to any of those, and neither does anyone else. Those aren't identities. They're not identities. They're masses of ideological confusion, and that's all. An identity tells you and other people how to perceive and how to conduct yourself.
And man and woman, boy, girl, male, female are stable categories. They're reality. And to teach children any different to that is to lie to children and to lie to teenagers. And it's the most distressing thing for me to observe this going on, that it's done in the name of kindness, it's done in the name of compassion, It's seen as the only legitimate way to help these kids, and it's so cruel. I mean, I think you pointed out before, what you're doing is you're affirming, particularly a teenage girl's self-hatred and self-rejection and absolute hatred and disgust about being female. You're affirming that, and you're saying, yep, you're right to feel that way. It's, reject, let's kill off that person. And let's replace that defective woman or girl with a boy. And we agree with you, the boy is so much better. This is who you really are. So the lie there is like, being a girl or a boy isn't who you are, it's what you are. It's just fact. Who you are is your personality, is your personality traits, what you do, whatever. being a boy or a girl isn't who you are, but how it's sold to children, and it's sold to children at the earliest ages. I've counted there's about 40 picture books for primary years now, is that it uses the messages that are given to children now. So be who you are, be yourself. And the other, when to a child, who hasn't developed a self yet, and it's it's a lifetime's job in my experience. But then also the other really strong message is, you know who you are, and nobody else has the right to question you. Yeah. Now, this is indoctrination from the early years onwards. So age 3, as soon as children start kindergarten, these books exist. So what you're doing is you're taking away from that child, or this generation of children, the stability of reality and the ability to differentiate between fantasy and reality at the most fundamental level of who they are. And the way, in this sense, that we're now the children and they're the adults is part of this message that parents are given. Your child is born whole with a fully formed sense of self. And so, my 4-year-old boy, she knows who she is. It's not up to us to question that, our child's wisdom. And, the child is dependent on us as parents. Our job, and we don't even see this as a job, it's just automatic. A child will say, look, Mummy, there's a dog. And we'll say, yes, it's a dog. And we can't, or that's a dog. No, darling, actually, it's a cat. We will constantly reinforce our growing child's sense of what's real and what's not. And we correct them.